Trends Research and Advisory is proud to present its Trending Echoes podcast from the Global Media Conference in Abu Dhabi today on the 14th of November. My name is Stephen Scarlett from the Trends Global team, and this afternoon's topic is climate adaptation. Joining us today is ظبية القبيسي, who is the country's file supervisor in European political affairs at the UAE Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. ظبية is speaking today in a personal capacity, and her positions don't necessarily reflect those of the UAE Ministry or of the broader government. ظبية, after graduating from NYU Abu Dhabi with a joint degree in political science and visual arts and a diplomatic traineeship at the Anwar Gargash Academy, you joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You were also a youth delegate to COP27, which is the first one that we meet, an official youth delegate, and also present as a negotiator at the Bonn Climate Change Conference. ظبية is also studying for her master's degree at UCAM and DHAD University. It's a joint program with a view to graduating sometime this year or perhaps next. We aim to bring the views of experts to society and to our listeners. So ظبية, in that respect, you're a perfect guest because you're an expert. And so we look forward to hearing your views on climate adaptation. I'm delighted to welcome you here today or this afternoon to the episode of Trending Echoes for what I'm certain will be an enlightening and interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for having me today. I am really honored and happy to be part of this conversation, and I appreciate it.
It's really our pleasure, ظبية. So today we explore climate adaptation, which until COP26 had, there was a sense that there wasn't sufficient focus institutionally in terms of funding, in terms of policy on climate adaptation, at least as compared with mitigation. But over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen, apart from from COP28 and the institutional side of things, we've seen a kind of an acceleration in the impact or the apparent impact of climate change, especially in Europe, many other parts of the world. The forest fires in the south in Greece, Spain, Italy, the European rivers being very low, the Rhine, the Po in Italy, and the other great rivers of Europe. So there's a sentiment that the time has come for climate adaptation, to accelerate the agenda, the institutional setting, the policy, and the implementation of the specifics on the ground to try to adapt to the changing climate. At Trends Research, we also study the climate security nexus quite closely, and that work tells us that at an extreme, a lack of climate adaptation, a lack of resilience can lead to, and of course with the ecological degradation of water risk, food insecurity, natural disasters, population growth, can lead to some very bad outcomes involving conflict and violence. So it's critical to avert or to adapt to the worst aspects of climate change. And the moment is really here and now with this COP in the UAE. One of the themes of COP, ظبية, is inclusivity. We hear a lot about this. It's an official theme of COP, as it should be. And I was wondering whether, what are your thoughts? How do we relate what we're doing today, this podcast, to the theme of inclusivity and public awareness?
This was a very interesting introduction to your question, and I have to say I agree with you in all of what you said. Adaptation wasn't really receiving enough attention in previous COPs up until Glasgow COP26.
Right.
And the reason for that may be perhaps that ever since it was mentioned in the Paris Agreement in 2015, understanding and creating a framework that would be applicable to all countries was a very challenging task. Because if we sit today and we look at what adaptation means to an oil-based country, or what adaptation means to a small island country, or to a country that has all its economy is based on agriculture, how do you create a framework that's a fit-all
everybody, right?
framework? Yeah. So I think this could be one of the reasons to why adaptation was not addressed earlier, but the need and the urgency for climate action kind of shifted this discourse a little bit. And in COP26 and COP27, the main conversations and what really took most of the conference is adaptation, its loss and damage, and its finance. Because if you really think of it, finance cross-cuts across all the themes in climate change. And it's a very crucial question when you say, okay, we all have to adapt. How do we adapt?
Mm-hmm.
How are we going to adapt? By which means? And who's responsible? So these kind of questions really raise certain efforts, certain frameworks to be addressed. On another note, in terms of inclusivity, I will quote here Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, the president of COP28, who said that UAE is aiming for COP28 to be an inclusive, leave no one behind COP. And I remember the first time I heard him say it on stage. I had goosebumps because a worldwide challenge such as climate change is not really only about climate change. You cannot talk about climate change without addressing certain issues, without addressing adaptation, without addressing funding, without talking about infrastructure, without going into technical details on how each country will be acting, behaving, and supporting as well.
Very interesting. It's about the implementation and the specifics ultimately, and how people's lives are affected. How do you see that the community here in the UAE or internationally, the education system, schools, the public awareness side of things? How do you see that developing in the future? Do you think that it will receive a big, obviously a big boost from this COP? But what are some of the mechanics? How will it change with respect to how it is now?
I'm glad you asked this question, because going to COP27 as a youth delegate, first of all, I was astonished by the amount of youth I saw in COP27.
Really?
And the effort that the UNFCCC and all the organizations that are collaborating and working with the UNFCCC have put in terms of including youth, to have their voice within these meeting rooms, within these negotiations. And when we talk about climate change, we see that it's a serious issue, but also we see that the effects of it are on a long-term basis. And so when we think of that, who's really going to be affected in this long term? It's the youth and the future generations.
Right.
And so it was very important to include the voice of the youth. And to add on what you said, during my time in the Bonn Climate Conference, which is a conference that happens between every COP and another, and this one was called SB 58. So during that, I was able to see the efforts and the voices of the local communities. Because when it comes to policies and implementation, you have almost two ways of doing it. One would be starting from a policy, high level, government level, and it would go down all the way to...
Top down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you have also the other way, which is starting from the people, from the local communities, going all the way up to inform the government and the policies of a country. And so in this sense, when addressing climate change, we cannot have a gap between the policies and the societies and communities of people. And so this really shows the importance of raising awareness, of being part of this almost change, if you wish to say. And adding more on that, I think here we are today in this podcast. Definitely we are contributing to raising this awareness, because when we sit and we share our experiences, when we have these conversations regarding climate change, adaptation, we do create a new common knowledge that will inform how people behave, how climate change will be addressed by individuals themselves. And I think it's really important. So I really appreciate you having me here today.
Well, that's very well put, Tabia. We as a think tank, our main thing is to contribute to the discourse, to the intellectual, to the thought leadership. And so that is, in a way, I mean, you've put it very eloquently, that is what we're doing here today. I was fascinated to learn about the role of communities at Bonn. So are there communities which are more active? They were mostly from, which part of the world, or which how are they organized when you say these active communities at Bonn?
To answer that question, I have to point out that over the last few years, the voices of indigenous people have been highlighted heavily in COP28 to also take into account their expertise when dealing with nature, when dealing with the environment, and the traditional ways of how they maintain the environment, of how they contributed to the well-being of their environment. And so that is one example, in the sense that there are groups of indigenous people from different parts of the world who would have a seat on the table in terms of sharing their expertise and also informing their current situations back home and what is exactly happening with them. And alongside that, there are many NGOs who are partake in COP28, and not just in the sense that they are part of the events and the informing of people and all that, but also they are part of the negotiation rooms. They get to attend. And one thing I really found very interesting is that the role of research and think tanks in climate change negotiations. And that's in the sense, if we sit in a room, and let's say we have 27, or let's make it more realistic, 192 members who are having a conversation on how should we adapt. And this is just an example, so it doesn't really reflect any reality. I'm just doing it for the sake of explaining my point. These 192 members who are having this conversation, let's say they struggle to find a common ground for an agreement that they could all agree on. A think tank organization or an entity that is attending this negotiation will take note of this challenge that they are facing, and could go and provide research and explore thinking outside the box, other options that could work for the 92 countries or the 92 members in this situation. And so this was one of the highlights for me, honestly, in any multilateral organization meeting that I've attended. And it's how it's an ecosystem of decision making. It's not one, it's not just states, it's people, it's entities, it's research and scientific informing. It's really so much more than just what we might think it is.
Very interesting. These are insights we can only get from somebody who's actually sat at the table, right? Because we don't really know. The negotiations are largely closed door, so it's very unusual and fascinating to hear about some of the dynamics going on behind the scenes. And good to hear about the role of communities and youth and all the non-traditional actors and drivers who are legitimately now part of the process. I think it's a wonderful dynamic for adaptation in particular. So, again, in terms of adaptation, what were the main insights that you drew from, for example, COP27 and the Bonn conference? Did you see much actual progress, or was it just the multilateral agreement side of things?
I think it's a difficult theme in COP in general, because adaptation really hits on more than one aspect of climate change. Having that said, the progress is actually very slow. It's been very slow, but I'm very optimistic. I don't think that having slow progress would mean that it's not going to happen, or it's not going to receive the crucial or the importance it deserves. But I actually, on the contrary, really believe that this is the time to amplify the importance of adaptation. And I say that not only because as adaptation and what it means, but also adaptation is really a cause for loss and damage, which is another theme of COP28, COP27, climate change in general.
Of course.
So if countries and states do adapt in a manner that enables them to minimize the loss and damage, then we will not be required to overwork ourselves into creating a bigger fund for loss and damage, into going extra miles in that sense. So it really, the conversation of loss and damage starts with adaptation.
Right, of course it does. ظبية, when you mentioned the role of think tanks, of course I was delighted to hear that think tanks have a role to play in a multilateral climate setting. And it brought to mind the launch of a report recently. It's called the Ecological Threat Report. And that report identifies on a global basis the countries that are most vulnerable in an ecological threat sense. So natural disasters, water risk, food security, and so on. It identifies these countries globally in terms of which country could be pushed over the edge by a scenario of ecological threats, climate change-driven threats, and degenerate into conflict and violence. And so the interesting thing about this report, it's very well researched and statistically based, but the interesting thing is that it produces like an objective ranking, so that is, when you mention the difficulty of countries agreeing, of course, first, everybody has to agree on the facts, on a level and objective, preferably statistical basis. Once that agreement is in place, then we can move on to solutions. So I thought the report, that's pretty good, because it does provide an indication on a global level, statistically valid for policy making, of which regions and countries are most vulnerable. So I thought that was a great way of looking at resilience or lack of resilience on a global level. ظبية, I want to ask you something, and that is based on my impression that your career path has been very linear. It seems that you always wanted to do this, to become a diplomat and to be engaged in climate sustainability and so on. So really, what drove you? What's your dream?
Okay, Stephen. Before I answer this question, I wanna note on something regarding the think tank research paper that you were referring to. In COP28, interestingly, there will be an element where they deliver the global stocktake.
Right.
And the global stocktake is actually very similar to what you were saying in terms of that research paper. it actually informs us on how far we've reached in terms of achieving what we were out to achieve, and how much is left for us. So it's going to be like an assessment of an assessment on a global scale of where we are today in terms of climate change action. And interestingly as well, in the global stocktake, there are subsections, one on mitigation, one on finance, one on adaptation, and one on loss and damage, and also many other topics. But these are the big ones. And when it comes to adaptation, the conversation is still going in terms of agreeing on the framework, agreeing on the sovereignty of states to deliver their own plans of adjustments and implications, but at the same time adhere to an international claim on adaptation. And so these elements are still going back and forth in order to deliver an outcome for adaptation. And what I believe makes it a little bit more challenging than mitigation, perhaps, is that adaptation is harder to quantify in terms of data. Because mitigation, you have a degree that you want the temperatures to stay within. So that's quantified in a way. But how do you address measures that are qualitative? How do you address these measures when it's a different set of information with different set of geography? And I honestly feel like I was very happy to be placed in this topic, adaptation, because the topic itself is mind stimulating. You do think about how a common ground will be reached, and you don't lose hope as well, because you want everyone to be happy. So I thought that was interesting to share as well. And
it certainly was.
In order to answer your question on my dream, I've always knew that I wanted to take a path that would involve people, and it would involve policy, and I would also have an artistic element to it. I still don't know how all these factors will interplay together. I am in the course of finding that out, but so far it's been great, because I think I found myself in diplomacy for sure. And I really look forward to how I will be combining art and diplomacy, given that I am an artist myself. And I do believe that art serves as a medium for many things, and it could be used for great purposes in that sense.
Well, art plays into it also plays into the public awareness aspect of whichever theme it's associated with. And are you aware that we have commissioned an artwork for COP28?
I am aware.
So we've done that, and the thinking behind it is quite, it's quite sophisticated and combines various objectives and also the relatability of art. Art is universal, in a sense, in the same way that climate change is universal and climate diplomacy is a universal impulse. So we're doing that. But when you say that you're thinking about how to combine art with your diplomatic activity, I mean, what do you see in the future? Do you have any ideas about how that can happen?
Honestly, no. No, honestly, yes and no. Because no, I still don't see how I could be interplaying them both at the same time in a way they feed each other. So my art career would contribute to my diplomatic career, and my diplomatic career would contribute to my art career. But I do know that art isn't something you could separate from politics. And as a way they almost seem that they're on completely two different grounds. Actually, they are very intertwined. Because if you look at history and you look at the role art played in many of historical facts and historical contexts, you'd see that it was always there. And art will always be a medium for humanity, a medium for community and expression. And I think those are important things to have around politics.
Absolutely. When you're talking, it came to mind that when we read history, we read about empires, inevitably it's the cultural production that remains.
100%.
If you think about the Parthenon, the great classical sculptures, or indeed any cultural production of any civilization, that's what remains. Once people move on, the art remains and the culture remains. So that's a very interesting dimension to explore. I was also curious, Tabia, about your master's in humanitarian aid and development, because that takes you in a slightly different track, although of course it's a major instrument of foreign policy, humanitarian aid. But how do you see that? Do you see it as separate from climate diplomacy, or do you see it as more related to the traditional instruments of foreign policy?
I believe that similarly to Leonardo da Vinci, who's a polymath, who was an architect, a mathematician, a scientist, an artist, and a sculpturist, and a painter as well, to be able to combine all these things, it means he did not see limits for himself. He didn't think, I held this brush, I am a painter for the rest of my life, and that's all I'm ever going to be. And I think we should be open to having multiple layers of experiences and expertise, and not limit ourselves to maybe one field. And by doing that, I believe we harness deeper set of values that will cross-cut across all these fields. So as an artist, I become very empathetic, and I become very aware of emotions, very aware of sociology as a science and its impact on society and the phenomena that happen in a society, to have that awareness. I am very sure that this is going to serve me in my path also as a climate negotiator or as a person who gets involved in negotiations.
You need empathy and sensitivity.
Definitely. I think those are the most important things for a negotiator and I don't want to limit it to just a negotiator.
I understand.
But I think these values are very important to have and harness in general.
They certainly are. In research, we do what's called multidisciplinary research. The concept is perhaps not as rich as value laden, but the idea is to get many eyes, many perspectives, and that can only enhance the quality of the work. Dabia, we thank you very much because you've brought an incredible amount of diversity of perspective. At the beginning of this conversation, we expected to talk about climate adaptation, but you've interwoven certain elements very convincingly, and that I think will enrich not only your work at the Foreign Ministry and your participation in COP, but also the broader climate efforts of the UAE and globally. So it's been wonderful to have you here today. We thank you very much, and we look forward to connecting again with you in the near future.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I had a really good time having this conversation with you, and really appreciate deep, nuanced questions. Thank you so much.
Very kind. Thank you again.